7:33, and I call to order this meeting of the RTM Finance and Budget Committee. Um, so uh, there's a couple quick little things that I want to go through. Michael, Mike, I've added you to Human Services to work with Bill Smith, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you. Um, and we'll go from there. I think the first thing is where Beth and Peter, there was a Board of Ed meeting on Tuesday, and I thought it'd be good if you and anybody else who went there could give an update.
Okay, I will say
going first.
it was the shortest Board of Ed meeting ever. The agenda was essentially two things. It was the public hearing, which traditionally is when a lot of people of town have come and given speeches. It tends to sort of drag on, and there don't usually tend to be other agenda items. This one was a little different in that there was an agenda item to continue like further discussions on the budget. And also unusual was that there were very few public comments. I suspect because the week before, everybody under the sun gave a public comment and didn't have anything new to say. So it was actually, the meeting was like half an hour. Shockingly short. Yeah. And indeed, when the board was given an opportunity to ask further questions and sort of clarify their thinking about the budget, nobody really had anything to say or any questions. So my problem with that is it makes it very hard for me to figure out what it is that the board is planning on doing next Tuesday, which is when they have to actually vote in a budget.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to amplify some of those comments. I was traveling at one of the recent board meetings. I think it was Tuesdays. And one of the commentators, one of the public speakers, made a very interesting comment about the disproportional nature of the increase or proposed or the growth, the growth in spending is coming from essentially non-discretionary fixed costs. And it's really an angle that nobody's talked about that much, I think. And how does that affect the long-term impact of the budget, not just this year, but looking towards next year. And this person is Doug Kreutz. I'll give credit where credit's due. He had an interesting comment that not only are we going to face larger increases in special ed aspects of the budget, but also obviously with transportation and with other things like contracts, with this larger percentage of the increase attributable to fixed non-discretionary costs, if it's going to really, there are bigger problems down the road.
Is that called inflation? I mean, is it going up?
No, actually, and it's gonna. I'm gonna. I had a conversation actually with the board chair, Jill McCammon, and with John Cini today, and a couple of the items were very interesting in terms of the special ed sector has two major drivers. One is the lack of accredited special ed teachers. The other one is that a lot of these special ed schools are for-profit schools that are now owned by private equity, apparently. So the cost of that isn't going anywhere but up. So we need to really work on hard at trying to maybe find a better way to be able to handle these services, the quality services that we want to provide in-house. And this is something that's been going on for the dynamic that we've all been working on for a long time. Fitch Academy is a great example of trying to find a better mousetrap to serve our students here in town. And so, there's in my mind there's kind of like a collision between that trend and trying to manage the budget by the Board of Finance with guidance that doesn't take that into account. And eventually the board's going to have to dig into some areas that it's going to hurt. Maybe not this year, maybe next year. I'm not sure how that's going to be, but it was an interesting discussion. I think the two boards are working together very well to try to get to the right answer and find the right number and the right things to right budget adjustments. And they're working on that.
Uh,
So
I'm going to add, though, a couple of things to answer, which may be unpopular. First of all, the Board of Ed and the Board of Finance were speaking to each other prior to the guidance. So
yes,
so I want to make that clear that they were having those conversations.
yes, they
Now,
were.
Now, there's two parts to some of the things on Pierre and I were texting during one of the prior meetings. So yes, food costs have gone up, except food costs have no effect on the operating budget of the Board of Ed because the cafeteria is its own separate fund. And if the costs go up, they raise the price and they end up being a net sum zero fund every year. So food prices have nothing to do with that. Increase in cars and other things like that, we don't really buy. We'll occasionally buy a Suburban, and yes, we'll see it. But when you're looking at $120 million budget to buy a $60,000-$70,000 vehicle once every so often, that again doesn't have the effect as does inflation, as does housing and other things like that, all which is in the CPI number. They just don't affect the school. Where we do see a little bit is on healthcare.
Are you putting insurance into that category too?
Which type of insurance are you talking about? Because there's several. Let me continue. So on the medical insurance, yes, there's been cost inflation for medical services, but when you're calculating out what your insurance would be for health insurance for a business or a district or government, what your pool is and what your experience is has a bigger driver than just the costs on the health insurance. And it was last year or so they mentioned that we had 20 or 30 individuals who had some very significant medical bills, and these are current or former employees. And so we would be considered a high-risk pool. So even at the 14%, we would have been higher compared to our peers who may be at 9%. We're higher because of our experience that we have. And, I don't want anybody to think negatively about those current and former employees. I'm more concerned that a current or former employee who's dedicated their services to our town has themselves and their family experiencing such major medical issues to the family. So, that's part of the way that we're even higher. Should the experience have been there, we would have been higher than the 14%. But the group that we're in, the consortium, has a cap. And so we're being capped. We do see inflation really when we're building new schools. That's where we really get hit with the inflation because of the materials and everything else that drives up the costs. And that really happened partially on HHR when we were going out for bid. So that comes back to us where, and I'm just going to make up two numbers, which something might have cost 80 million is now costing us 100 million. That's 20 million more of debt service that we have to pay with interest over the next 20 years. So we will see inflation in that regard. As for teacher salaries, there's a couple of things. First of all, it is the inflation that was going on, and 4% was what I believe was a strong budget, because I do believe that the strength of our school system is the teachers in that are there. And I'm a little prejudiced. Both my parents were educators, so I understand that side of it. But the other part of that is we have to pay a competitive rate compared to what the other schools are doing in their union contracts. So like you'll see it happens. We don't all do it at the same year, but let's say New Canaan had their union contract last year and we have one up this year. We know what the teachers in New Canaan got, and if we want to compete against that, we have to meet it. Now, whether or not that's driven by competition or driven by inflation or driven by the fact that we're at the tail end of of the state, so people are traveling here, those factors all add into what we'll eventually have with our union contract. There's other benefits that are there. Some school districts allow somebody who's teaching within the district to have their children come and attend school in that district if they don't live in town. At one time, Darien had it. I don't know when we stopped that. I don't know why we stopped that, but we don't offer that. So that sometimes is a nice benefit that keeps teachers participating in being employed, so we don't have some of the turnover that you had. So those are the main areas. Fuel costs actually for diesel on transportation, we're signing a 5-year contract. So last year when we were figuring out that we were going to take over special ed and bring that in-house, we were then signing a 5-year contract. So those costs are pretty much fixed. And we do pay for diesel fuel, but diesel fuel is, fuel is down. It's not up from the prior year. So the big thing there that would possibly save Darien about $500,000 a year is that we get limited bids because we do not have a place in town to store 30 or 40 buses that also could have a little mechanic station and a dispatcher and an assistant dispatcher there. And so they're actually parking in Stanford, right over the bridge there at Cummings. Not Cummings, that road that goes up from 106 that goes over to exit 9. So they go down there and park their buses there. So they're charging us that. But because of that, there are other bus companies that do not even bid on Darien's bus routes. So, I can't say whether or not they're competitive or not. That's, again, not my expertise. But that has been raised. But we would have to find a location that would allow us to do that in town. And then, by the way, I'm sure there's not a lot of neighbors who want to have 30 buses starting up in the beginning of the day with their exhaust saying, "Why are you doing this where I live?" So where New Canaan takes their buses and parks them at the high school, and that saves them money. So there's a lot of things that are built into that, but while inflation has some effect, it's not the same inflation that we saw earlier during the pandemic and then going back the other way. The Board of Selectmen will actually see more of that because when oil prices went up one year, the cost of buying blacktop was so expensive that we actually deferred doing paving of our roads until the prices came down. And there's several other things that their purchase that actually has more of an impact from inflation. On the other side, a lot of our systems that we provide to the kids, systems are going up in price. And so there's also a significant amount of edicts coming down from the department from Hartford, not just for us, but for all towns, that has no funding associated with it. So, you have to do this. And by the way, go figure out how to fund it. Excess cost reimbursement, which is supposed to be the safety net for special ed costs. Well, they broke it down into 3 categories. The poorest cities at the first get a 1% rate. The ones in the middle get a different percentage rate. And there's about 20, 25 towns, of which we're one of them, which are the wealthier towns in the state, and we get the lowest rate. But that would be okay. But they're not growing the funding for that equal to the submissions that all the towns in the state are doing. So there's less and less money to be distributed amongst the towns. And so here's a safety net that, quite honestly, they're not funding. And so while it affects us, I mean, with all due respect, we can handle some of this slower funding, but it's also affecting a lot of other towns and cities in the state that don't have the resources we do, which undermines services that those towns are providing potentially. So that gives a little bit of the overview on some of the costs that we have coming down the road. The other thing that, this is what somebody mentioned to me, so it's not my idea, but you know, when I did consulting work and you implemented something, you went back and you looked at what you implemented. You decide what's working well, what's not working well, what other new problems you've created, and determine whether or not you have to fix that. And that may mean you add funds or you change what you've already done. I don't see that, and others don't see that, of what goes on in the school system. So we've had a great deal of children learning Chinese, which is great, but the offset to that was that there was supposed to be a reduction in the number of students that are taking Spanish, because those are the only two classes offered in middle school. And if we've seen a reduction, then that should relate to some change in what the teaching is. And so there may have been that reduction. I don't know this for a fact, but there may have been a reduction in the number of students taking Spanish, but there may not have been the offsetting savings that they had put into the original analysis. And so those are all things that I'm just picking on that. You know, I'm happy that both of them there, and I'm not sure that that's a fact. But as an example, those are things that are supposed to be looked at. And I don't know that they have. And some people are getting the feeling that it hasn't been. So, and that's part of what happens when you have this budget. You're constantly supposed to be looking for efficiencies, looking on how to do things better. And by doing things better, that may mean that you're adding funds to that and that. So it's not just efficiency for the sake of reducing a budget. It's efficiency for making sure you're attaining your goals. And so, you know, I hope that provides some additional information from a perspective on what I think the Board of Finance is
I want to
doing.
thank you. I want to thank you for giving me that perspective myself personally. But and I want to add one point that I was involved with a small town once that had the same bus issue that we have, and they found land basically in the cemetery to park the buses, which didn't affect any neighbors. So I don't.
Well, I don't know. I live across from one in the cemetery. I like my neighbors across the street. They're very quiet, and occasionally I hear bagpipes, which I rather enjoy. So
I don't think we have that much spare land in that cemetery either, do we?
no, I do not believe that. And quite honestly, I don't have enough fingers to count the number of people that I see to walk their dogs. Based upon the fact that I used to live there, my kids used to learn to ride their bikes in that cemetery. But the deal is after we got done riding the bikes, we picked up all the papers and other things and put it in the trash. So the guys who are doing the service there actually knew the kids by name. So it was kind of fun. But yeah, it's a very nice.
And that 11% jump in health insurance was due to a few people, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
I will say one of the problems is Darien is one of the most developed towns in the state, so there isn't a lot of spare land to just come up with a spot for parking buses because everything's been developed or donated to the land trust. So
Beth, it just occurred to me that there's an Episcopal church parking lot that's been vacant for years.
That
And
is true.
it's like I think we should explore whether we should be renting this back to the town to get a win-win.
That is true. I mean, the diocese would have to agree to it, but it is just kind of moldering away up there.
And they don't have any current plans. I think they're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
I think we should explore that. That could be a win-win for the town
I
and
think,
for the church.
I don't know how much space you need, but definitely that's a worthwhile endeavor to be a win-win for both
Yeah.
Yeah.
the church as well as the town. But
Yeah.
yes, that's worthwhile to explore.
It's essentially just abandoned property. It's just sitting up there on Mansfield Avenue doing nothing.
But it's owned by
The neighbors around Mansfield may not want to look at a bunch of buses.
That is
you
true.
know,
Yeah, that's
Just
true.
just
we
saying.
know that. We
Not
know
that it's
that.
not a bad idea, but
I don't think there's a lot of neighbors that actually see that parking lot, are there?
I don't think
no,
so.
that's actually
either.
that's a good point, Doug. But there are, I mean, people around there, people drive by there. I don't know. Some people might be sensitive to that.
You
I
got
also don't know that
school
there's
up the
enough.
road.
I've been in that parking lot for services, and memorial services, and I don't know that that's big enough to hold the number of buses they would have to hold. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
So, but it's a good thought. You know, that's
I
how we
think
have
we're
to
going to
start
explore
thinking.
that. Why not?
So, and that's definitely putting Dan on the hot seat. But no,
No,
Well,
it's
there
gonna get
is,
me
I
on the
mean,
hot
there
seat.
is a plan, I think, in the works. The diocese just moves very slowly. So
Oh, well,
I'm sorry, I was just teasing you.
no, I got you. Yeah. Fully fair.
Anything else or any other comments or questions on the
I have
Board of Ed
one
budget?
since
Go
I've
ahead.
sat through the two longest, most painful Board of Ed meetings, like I'm really bummed I missed the 30-minute one. Is our sense then that the revised budget that the superintendent came back with at the last lengthy meeting is the direction they're headed in? Or are we really just blind?
I feel like it's blind because what I do like about the normal ad cut night is that you get a sense of what people are thinking about and where they're looking for efficiencies. You know, individual board members will propose individual cuts and then there might be discussion and you get a sense of the room. This was all presented by the superintendent and it seemed like there were a lot of real questions about it. But then so many different things, there's so many different combinations of cuts that have been proposed that at this point, it seems like what I can say is it looks like they want to retain at least some of the paraprofessionals in the elementary schools. It might be 2 paras and 1 intern or something like that, but they don't want to get rid of all of them and that they will not increase class sizes in the 2nd and 3rd grades. That's the affirmatives that they've stated. Other than that, I mean, it's your guess is as good as mine. I kind of feel like they might be throwing darts at a board and see what it lands on because it really was, there's no real indication that I would normally have a better sense and I don't have much of a good sense.
So for those that are new, in one of the documents that I've probably sent out, there's a list of all these different items of what's potential cuts. So it's what the superintendent originally put there. Anybody like, you know, hopefully the 5,500 to be certified that we're a safe school is up there. So somebody has a plaque on the wall instead of using that money to face students. And some of the other things will all be listed there. And I believe there's something like about 40 or 50 of them there already. And they're color coded. And if I could remember the colored coding, I would tell you, but I don't.
Yeah.
So what will happen that night is that they'll go through that list and they'll go, does somebody move this? And if there's no second, it immediately fails. If there is a second, there'll be a discussion and a vote. And it'll be either an up or down vote, or somebody might say, like on the paras, I believe it's 1.5 million. We want to keep 2 of them. So we want to adjust that cut to be 500,000. And so they'll vote on the motion, and then they'll vote on the adjustment, and then they'll vote on the final amount. And that will go through for every one of those things that are there. And when they're done, that ends up being the budget that they then hand to the Board of Finance. And so the Board of Finance, there's a legal date, I believe it's March 4th, where both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance legally have to deliver their budgets to the Board of Finance. And they'll do a little dog and pony show and explain it. Some of them are kind of fun to watch. Some of them are just, here it is, bye, thank you. You've already heard everything here. So when the Board of Finance, that's where we start getting involved with, we were talking about the buddy system, going and looking at these different groups, asking the questions, speaking to our counterparts in the Board of Finance and the other committees, getting a sense where everybody is. And some people, the Board of Finance then has the authority to adjust that budget. They cannot increase that budget. They can adjust it, which is what they did last year. Now, contrary to what some people think, if you came from New York State, the schools were their own taxing authority. And so they were able to maintain reserves. So I know one person said you should give back the $2 million you cut, as if the school has a fund on its own. That's not true. The school, all the expenses are paid for the most part, 90%, unless it's coming out of one of those little mini funds that they have, are paid out of the town's general fund. The general fund pays for all the salaries, all the expenses, all the bus contracts, all the other things are all coming out of that fund. At the end of the year, any surplus that the school might have sweeps back into the general fund, and that's going to be monitored fairly closely by the Board of Finance and the Director of Finance to estimate how much funds will be in the general fund at the end of the year. And I'll go why that's important a little bit later, but that's necessary to determine how we get to the final budget number. And I'll show you some reconciliations. So where in New York State, they have their own little reserve account. So that's one thing. We had a superintendent who came over from New York, and he had to get used to that he didn't have his own money that went from one year to the next. So if he saved this year, he could use that money next year. Not how it works in Connecticut. So that's, just giving a little bit of esoteric information about how we close out our books. Is there anything else on that? But that can be a very long night. One time in the past, we were going through cuts at 1 o'clock in the morning. Hopefully it's a lot quicker this year.
I'll be there so you guys don't all have to be.
Thank you.
Should be delightful.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be at the Board of Finance. All right. So let's turn to the Board of Selectmen budget. And let me see if I can share. I have 2 screens here that I want to share. Which one do I want to do first? This one. Okay. So this is the final, if you want to call it, cheat sheet for what was being done over the last couple of days. And just so that everybody knows, Pierre, when he wasn't at that short meeting, was sitting there every night with me over at the Board of Selectmen meeting. So, you know, that's yeoman's duty to do that. But they've made a couple of adjustments here. I'm going to put on my glasses. Now, when we get the final budget, what we're going to see is Board of Selectmen budget. The library is a grant incorporated in that. We're going to see debt service. Then we're also going to see a capital item, which isn't in this line item. And then we're going to end up with Board of Education operating budget. The capital budget that we're going to see is going to include both the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen capital requests that they're asking to be improved. The non-tax revenues and the investment incomes, the Board of Ed has a net number. So if they're making revenue from participation fees, or they're getting excess cost reimbursement grants back, that is within their total appropriation. And if they get more money back than what they budgeted, that's for they have those, and they don't have to give it back. They can use it to spend on other things. On the Board of Selectmen side and on the town side, we're going to add up the Board of Selectmen, library, debt service, capital requests, Board of Ed, and then we're going to deduct this 13 million here that you see, which is the other non-tax revenue investment income, from the total amount that we're looking to spend. And then that's the amount of money that we're going to need to raise through taxes. And so that's going to be the numerator of the calculation for the mill rate. The denominator is the grand list, less certain adjustments, which was on list evaluation that I sent out to everyone, to come out to say, look, there's credits that we give that go over there. There's other adjustments that go in there. And then once we come up to that final number, we multiply it times an anticipated collection rate over the last 5 years, less 25 basis points, which equals about $300,000 to $500,000. That just allows us, if we have a lower collection rate, we're still collecting enough taxes, or if there's subsequent adjustments to somebody's valuation, that accounts for that. So, or we end up with more cars or less cars than what we anticipated we were going to get taxes for the year. So they don't really have a net number. So when they're saying 11%, when we go and look at what it is, their increase is really going to be this 8%. So what are some of the things that they did? So one of the things that they did during the budget is that investment income increased by $1 million, because when it was first calculated, it was anticipating that from when it was calculated, which was in November, December of last year when they're putting together the budget, that from that November through the fiscal year 26, there would be 4 reductions by the Federal Reserve. That doesn't look like that's happening. So they went back and they revised it to say there would be only 2 reductions in revenue. And they also calculate when we're doing bond proceeds, where we keep the bond proceeds, and some of the other things that we got. We also had a sweep account for some of our operating checking accounts, essentially. And that ended up, we lost that sweep account, and that was generating some funds that we're not going to have in the coming year. But we're probably going to end up with over $4 million this year in revenue from the investments, although we only budgeted $3.3 million. which means that incremental $1 million will also be put into the general fund available to be used on other things. So that was the big change on the investment income over here, why it went from 2 to 3. The other big change is that through negotiations, there's an adjustment of approximately $500,000 to reduce what we were paying at 11-12% on the healthcare costs to an 8% renewal by United Healthcare. That's still under negotiation, and we may, if something is negotiated and some additional changes, you might see that this committee is proposing to reduce the expenses on our budget night by an amount that we're being told by the Board of Selectmen. At that time, it doesn't need Board of Finance approval. And so we would do that and reduce the mill rate accordingly. We've done that in the past. So that's just the mechanics of how that will happen. So this may come down even further. But right now, with the Board of Selectmen operating, they're at 4.82%. The big increase is the debt service. And let me get over to debt service. We've been doing a lot of bond anticipation notes. And in fact, John Zagroski has put together a debt analysis that hopefully he'll be discussing at our February RTM meeting, that is looking at debt from a completely different thing than what I'm going to be talking about over here. The debt service for schools was, $6 million last year in the current year's budget. It's up to 7.6. Now, this is again an estimate because we haven't figured out exactly, the Board of Finance hasn't figured out what part is going to be bond anticipation notes, what's going to be real debt, what's the rate that we're going to get on this, and what are we going to get some premiums on that. The school, the rest of the town is going up from 6.4 million to approximately 7.3. Interesting enough, the last part is the sewer debt, which you're seeing here, is also moving up slightly, but the $235,000 of sewer debt is actually paid by the sewer fund, which collects the incremental money that they need from their operating budget by determining what the rate is for all of those of us who is hooked up to the sewer. So that only the town can issue debt. So the Board of Ed and the town debt and the sewer debt is all on the town side of the budget, but it really is broken out. That is one of the things, and I think we do have some concurrence on it, that just for information purposes, and not saying that it affects it, but at least people understand that when you're looking at the town Board of Ed debt, it's not just their operating budget. It's their net operating budget. It's the off-cycle requests that they have put in that's being paid either coming directly from the general fund that wasn't in the budget. It's the capital requests that making that we're not bonding. And it's debt service attributable to the schools. Now, one of the things that was very important to many of us when we voted in favor, and even those who voted against Great Island, is that there was an agreement that the debt associated with Great Island, which ultimately that hasn't been issued, it was originally higher. They took away 11 million of authorized debt, and there's a balance of about 6 million that hasn't been used yet, 4 to 6 million in there of authorized debt that hasn't been issued. and there's some bans floating around on that. But there was a basic agreement that by the purchase of Great Island, it was not supposed to have a negative impact on either the town or the Board of Ed operating budgets. And quite honestly, I don't think it has. So the fact is that with some costs that we do, I know, Peter, you disagree, but you voted against it. So, but the fact is that the biggest cost of what's going on in the debt is many of the other things that we have to do or have done. And we're going to talk about it when we're talking about how to reconcile the budget. That there's some items in there, you know, we committed $160 million for school buildings. There's another 75 million or more coming down the road, and $160 million of debt, assuming that some of it comes back on reimbursement from the state, is going to cost us about $10 million a year for about 20 years, since we try not to do 30-year debt because you need to redo a school in 20 years. So, so that's a good part of why our debt is going up. But John's going to give some better explanation of why that's not a major concern to the town. I do want to get back to some other aspects of this budget on the first page. So if you look at the capital requests, and I got to move something. Here we go. So the RFCNRE, that's the amount that the Board of Selectmen is asking to be paid for by the Reserve Fund of Capital Non-Recurring Expenditures. So that's their capital. That's part of their capital. There's bonding that's going on. In one of the earlier things you saw, there was $10 million associated with Pear Tree Point, and there was a discussion on Weed Beach. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to give an update, since you're brave enough to freeze the cold with me on the school tour, that tour that they had of the two beaches. The 10 million, as well as the actual bonding for Weed Beach, is not going to be done on budget night. And part of that is we do not have the final estimate of what's going on with either one of those. And so we're probably going to get that after our June meeting, and probably take that up on what the final numbers are sometime in August or September off cycle, when we get an understanding of what's going on. There's also a discussion that the Board of Selectmen did to possibly move the dredging of Pear Tree over to the dredging, which there is no estimate for right now, for the channel. That would be done in Public Works, but there was no dollar amount put there for that. And again, that's going to be determined by when they lift up and do the testing of the soil, what they find there. Because depending upon what they find, we'll have different costs for how we dispose of it. So the parking operation capital and all these other things are pretty much paid for by their own fund. The recreation programs is all of the programs that the Park and Rec runs. The revenue goes into this special fund. The expenses associated with running those programs also go into that fund. We have to authorize the appropriation or they can't spend it. So the appropriation that they're authorizing is 1.6 million plus change. The other is Great Island Management, which originally was someplace in the 400. In the first year, it supposedly was a net zero because we have rentals. There are only 2 rentals there left. Both of them expire, I believe, end of June or July. Public Works will do work there, but there's not an allocation of their salaries to that. However, if they're buying any supplies or equipment, or as somebody said, if they buy a screw to be used on Great Island, that's put against the Great Island Management Fund. Plus, there's also consultants that are and outside contractors that are being used to do things like landscaping or mowing the lawns or other things like that. That's it. So that all goes in there, and that, based upon this year's estimate, is estimated to be 340,000 plus change, and we will be making an allocation from the Board of Selectmen budget into that fund during the budget night. So I hope that gives sort of an overview of where we are on the budget.
Hey, Jeff.
There are some things that are unknown, and we'll get to it. But now I'll open it up to conversation. Go ahead.
So this may be a bit of heresy, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. So if we're going to be, super efficient and we save all this money, $500,000 on our health benefit plan because we just renegotiate a better deal. And we, that may just be because we do a good job. Why do we have to adjust the mill rate? Why aren't we looking at this town-wide and going, well, why is the Board of Ed having to cut, some of the people there if, there's still money here? I'm losing perspective on the siloing budget process that comes back to a holistic number of a mill rate. And it's a little bit like we're starving one side to make another side look good and, keep its budget, great.
Well, I'd give you my response. If I had the same line item veto that I have on the Board of Selectmen as on the Board of Ed, that might be a different story, but we do not. We give them a total dollar, and I was one time quoted when they were trying to change the charter on this.
Yeah, well, we could give them, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, if there's this kind of savings coming, the Board of Finance could come back and give them the $500K we just saved so that they could apply it into the education budget.
If it still meets the overall plan, we're seeing an increase in our debt service of 20%, and we're not done there. All right. And so we do have, the only thing we really can control here. I mean, when we've committed to building schools. We're committing that we have to fix Pear Tree Point. We're committing that there's other investments that we have to do in town to maintain the infrastructure. And that's good. Most of that we're going to be bonding. And so that's a commitment. That's a fixed cost. I mean, we have to pay him back. I don't know how else to say it. I wish we didn't, but I'm not anticipating too many grants coming from the federal government lately. So the fact of the matter is we have to make that payment back. And as that grows, we need a couple of things to happen, which you'll see in my next slide that I want to share. We need to see a growth in our grant list. We need to maintain certain revenue streams. And we have to control, to the best we can, our operational spending, all right? Because we can control the operational expenses. The rest of the stuff we can't control. Whether or not it's Board of Ed, Board of Selectmen, those are things that people can actually control. Now, for those who've been around, and I started mentioning this a couple of years ago, because of various tools that we have available to the Board of Finance, and ultimately, I'm not complaining about it because I went before the RTM and say, do this. So I actually had to have some say on it, approving it. We've been actually masking the cost to run this town. So, if I'm seeing 4% increases here and 20% increases in my debt, and let's just say, the Board of Ed's looking for a 4.5, a much bigger budget, But let's say they come in at the same 4.8, all right? And we have less funds available to offset on some of the things that I'm going to talk about on the tools that are available, that how we bring it down. Well, maybe trying to hit a 3.5% mill rate isn't the right mill rate. Maybe it is a 5% mill rate. And that hurts in one side because, you know, there's our people on fixed incomes in this community. And, you know, the difference in the disparity in age between people with new families, people with kids in the school, people who are first starting to be empty nesters, and some of us who stay here just for the heck of it. You know, that change in diversity of ages and that is part of what creates a community. And so I don't want to be chasing people out because they can't afford their homes. So 5% is high to some people. We may end up at 6%, but I've been saying that we've been masking the real cost to run this town, and I thought that 3.5 was an artificial goal to attain, rather than letting people know this is what it really costs. And if we're going to provide the services, the education of what people want, we may be at a higher mill rate. And we might not be the third lowest mill rate of a major community in the state. But that's okay. If you want these services, this is what it costs to deliver. And still try and maintain our AAA rating and be able to absorb the debt and be able to have, if nothing else, the appraised value maintained. I'm not saying it's going to grow, but at least maintain the appraisals of our properties. And have people want to be here for, yes, the schools, but also because if you go to New York, it's a much easier commute. It does have beaches. And interesting enough, I was looking at the town plan of conservation from 2016. And then before Highland Farms, before some of the acquisitions by the land trusts that have happened in the 10 years, and before Great Island, when you count the country clubs and other things, 10% of the town of Darien is open space. Now, we're 98% built, but we do have a significant part that's open space, not all controlled by the town, mind you. But so, yeah, that's part of the job that the Board of Finance is going to be playing with when they're looking at what's going on. And ultimately, they're going to determine whether or not there is that if we go to 5%, that may be the decision. So I don't know. I mean, is there anybody else who I can't see everyone because of what I'm showing, so I don't see the full thing. But I mean, do other people have comments on, you know, we may need to have a 5% increase because that's what it costs to run the town? I'm not seeing any hands raised.
So, you know, I do have a concern, Jack. You know, Bill and I attended the Parks and Rec meeting, and, you know, there's a number beyond what we have to do for Pear Tree Point to save that beach, which is, you know, the beach is eroding, the parking lot is, you know, underwater many, many times of the year. But we also have to dredge Tilly Pond. We also have to dredge the pond in Cherry Hill Park.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. I just don't know how we're going to fund everything, including the plans that they have for Weed Beach. And I'm with you. I think there's probably more of a necessity with Pear Tree Point, but I don't know. We have to pay for all this. I'm just coming in to understand like how much money that all of this is going to cost.
And it's not just this year, because there's some things.
Oh.
And Mike, at least for a follow-up, yesterday, the Board of Ed took out the study for whether or not we can have employee housing. I think actually New Canaan bought a building for that. But they added back the what I used to refer to jokingly as the Black Lagoon, in which we should just have around Halloween, people go and look at the Cherry Lawn Pond and have somebody walk out as a monster, and maybe we could collect some money, because we have to dredge that. And they added the dredging for that back in, which for me made me very happy. I've been asking for that for 3 years. So, but yes, these are things we have to do to maintain the quality of our life, not just the schools, but for everybody else who's not in the schools, and for the school children that use those parks.
To be
You know,
to be fair, we don't have to do the project at Weed Beach. That's a nice to have, not a need to get
I
done.
I agree with you, Beth. Yeah.
they've asked for a new estimate on that without the walkway, which I think several people have known what my opinion of that walkway was. And I was very happy that I didn't have to raise it, that item. And they'll also do it with it to make a determination of what it is. We're still going to need a road and a path in there, but yes, that was the other major change that they made last night, and seemed to have complete support from the Board of Selectmen. Pierre, do you want to add to that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. It was interesting. I didn't get a sense that they felt the rest of the Weed Beach project wasn't necessary. Just that one walkway was really nice to have, but unnecessary given all the walking areas we have in town.
Including Weed Beach.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack.
mean, yeah.
I was there for the first Board of Selectmen meeting.
Right.
They talked about the fire department, and being new, I was a little surprised by the amount of capital expenditures that the fire departments and the marshal and the commission are asking for this year. I was wondering if you could provide your perspective on that. I mean, I know there's $2 million retaining wall plus the replacement of one of the engines, which is normal. But then I think I added up the CapEx and it's like 4.75 million for fire. And that seemed like that was a little surprising to me. Not saying it's not justified, but it seems like a substantial increase over the previous years.
So it was funny, if you recall, I was trying to determine who was going to manage the retaining wall. All right. And John said, oh no, we're going to have a building committee for that, because the town requires a building committee for any project over $1 million. So I was looking back over some of my prior notes. The original holding for that wall, that's now over $2 million, was 100,000.
Wow.
So this is a major work. And if you know Norotan Heights, they have that wall that sort of is there. And I really care about that, because that's the fire company that takes care of my property. And my neighbor's is a member of that group as well. But when they really brought in the engineers to look at this, that has become a $2 million plus initiative. And I promise you, we've looked at that every way this Sunday to see what's going on. So in that particular case, as you sort of heard, just because you heard a conversation between John Zagroski and myself about this. So we have a bid from June. If that bid is still going to be adhered to by the contractor, if we wait to the budget, that means that the first authorized expenditure on that can't occur until July 1st. So what budget we're going to approve, it stays in the budget. That's a July 1st expenditure. And we really can't guarantee that that price is going to stay the same.
Right.
So we're going to look to expedite that. The Board of Selectmen approved that now. Jen, enacting in her 5 roles that she has on that one hat, has to get to bond council so that there's a bond resolution and appropriation for that wall for the Board of Finance to approve. That will be coming back to our committee in March, where we'll be the lead on that. I'm trying to get somebody else to explain the details of the wall because I'm real good in accounting. Engineering isn't a strong suit of mine. And so probably Public Works will be reporting on what's being done. And then we'll be able to, 10 days after the RTM votes, they'll be able to initiate work on it. But that has become, and I've had a side conversation with Jen Chinesky, and she's really looked at this. I know Ed Gentile has looked at this. That's massive work that they're doing.
Yeah, it's going to be a big project.
Right,
And like the town's going to have a lot of capital expenditure projects going on like next year potentially.
Is this to prop up an obsolete fire station? I mean, shouldn't the money be going to put in a new fire
it's
station?
to prop up. It's to prop up some of the wall, and the fire station is far from obsolete.
Good.
So
good to know.
And one thing to understand, which is different than most places, all of our fire departments are volunteers. So we don't have paid firemen. We give them a small tax credit, depending upon how many hours, services, and years that they've done it. But and then the town pays for certain expenses for it. Now we buy the fire engines. So, but they do all the work to determine what's there. That's under review. There's a replacement schedule. It used to be, and this is part of what they were talking about, used to be you order a fire engine, you pay 25% up front, 18 to 24 months later, you get the fire engine. Then it went from 24 months to 3 years, and now it starts to look like we're not going to get a fire engine for 4 years. There's about 4 or 5 companies that are all in someplace in Minnesota or Wisconsin that they build these. It's one of those 2 states. So that's part of the reason why I was saying, if you have something here, shouldn't you be moving up when you do the definition of what you need so that we're getting it in time for when the replacement's supposed to be? And some of our fire engines are 30 years old. So, and they definitely need to be updated for the safety reasons, the new modern stuff and other things like that.
And
So
we don't
that's
have
part of the capital that they're requesting.
we don't have fire pensions. We don't have firemen. That's a big savings to the town to have volunteer fire protection. I'm not sure why we don't pay them an annual service fee for providing fire protection, but we do provide their equipment.
That's something you can bring up with the town. We do give them a tax credit. And we have an agreement if we have a volunteer firefighter that lives in Norwalk, we pass the tax credit on to Norwalk to give them a tax credit in their city of where they live.
And
So
we provide mutual aid from these fire stations to other towns that don't pay anything for their equipment.
you mean in this community, in this county, not only do the police, but the fire departments all work together. So if there's a big fire in New Canaan, it would not be unknown for our fire engines to go and help. In fact, there's certain equipment that exists in either Norwalk or Stamford that we do not have. We only have one major rescue that has all the, top of the line things. That's at the Darien Fire Department. The others have rescue, but not to the extent that that one does, because Darien usually responds to the major issues that are over on the highway. But I believe Stamford and Norwalk have the cranes that lift a vehicle up. We don't have that. So there's a mutual agreement that we all share and work together. Same thing happens on the water where, you'll see Norwalk, Darien, and Stanford if there's a needed rescue working with the Coast Guard. Regardless if it's in Norwalk waters or Stanford waters or Darien waters. Whoever gets there first starts the rescue and the search. So, or if there's a boat on fire, it takes care of that. So yes, there's a lot of agreements and, it works well. And, it's part of a greater community type of thing. So and we have actual agreements when we do police work so that if, like, let's say they're looking for a traffic stop on the Stanford-Darien border, there has to be a legal agreement between the two communities that would allow a Darien police officer to do something in Stanford and vice versa. We have the same thing with New Canaan and with Norwalk.
The last question I have on fire is, do they do fundraising? Or are they 501c3?
Yes, they are.
And
They own their buildings.
Yeah, but the fundraising they do at the end of the year for tax breaks for people that contribute to them, is it very? I haven't noticed it being a big effort, a big fundraising effort anywhere. Has it
Well,
been?
there are, there are different things that go on that's there. So throughout the year, used to be that if you were buying on Amazon, you could assign a charity to receive a certain percentage of your purchases. They've done that in the past, and people forget that they've done it, so they get their little things from there.
Because
it's like that subscription that you never got rid of and you still have.
Because they're private, though, no one knows how much they actually fundraise, do we?
Yeah.
We do?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't, but there's a coordination there's a fire commission, which is headed by by a representative from the 3 fire companies. And the captains and chiefs know that I joke calling it the heads of the 3 families get together, and I'm a New Yorker, so it just flows off my lips when I say that.
If there's ever a serious matter like a plane crash, I mean, the fire department takes over a town. They're in charge, right?
If anything happens of a major disaster on the roads, on the highways, like the merit really isn't in Darien, it's all in New Canaan. But if there's something of a serious nature, don't think that, and my daughter was a post 53. We have 3 ambulances there of anything of great need. Don't think that those ambulances and she's been on calls where all 3 ambulances that are in post 53 are responding to something in Norwalk or other things like that and getting people to where they need to be. This is just, I don't know how else to explain it, but it's how we work together as a community. We're responsible, and for the most part, they handle that. But yeah, if there's a major disaster, you would see if there's a major disaster, let's say in Norwalk going on, you would see fire departments coming down from Wilton, Westport, Ridgefield, Weston, all over. The community we just act that way. I don't know how else to explain it. So, I mean, it's one of the nice things about living in Fairfield County. The things that you don't hear about. Then you go to an FEX Sports and, go kill New Canaan. But on the other side, they work very well together. So, Mike, do you want to give some more comments on how you survived the frozen tundra in the 2 beaches?
Sure. So there's plans for Weed Beach and then Pear Tree Point. And like Beth had said, it seemed to me at least that, Weed Beach would, be more of a luxury, and that Pear Tree Point really was in, dire need. And, I'm afraid we're going to lose that beach unless we act on it. So for Pear Tree Point, they want to raise the parking lot. They also want to dredge a part of the beach, and then also repair some of the dock that's there. And I think what they had budgeted was about $10 million, if that's right, Jack, for Pear Tree Point.
As a placeholder.
As a placeholder, right? So, you could just imagine, as they work, that potentially can, escalate with what they have with the initial figure. For Weed Beach, they want to, there's, I don't know if there's a parking lot that's not paved. So the plan is they wanted to develop that parking lot and then put in a porous pavement. And then beyond that parking lot, there's this fallow kind of piece of land that's unused. And I think the town of Darien had bought it from a homeowner sometime in 2018, and it was part of like the wetland. So it just remained untouched. If you look at there's a few like picnic tables there, but they actually want to develop it. So they want to raise that lawn and level it. They're going to knock down some trees. And they wanted to build a pathway, a circular pathway around that new lawn. And then they're also going to move a part of that wasteland so that they can widen it. And they're going to also extend the beach, the Weed Beach, so that, where those where the kayaks are, they're going to actually push that back. So there'll be more of a beach. And I think the plans are, well thought of. I think it'd be nice for the town, but there's a $10 million spend for Pear Tree Point. There's a $2 million spend for Weed Beach, which is a placeholder too. And then Bill and I also went to the Park and Rec meeting, and like I had said before, they want to dredge Cherry Lawn Pond, but Tilly Pond, from what they reported back to us, has cyanobacteria, which is toxic. So it's like that blue algae. So that also needs to be dredged. And Bill, I just don't remember the cost of those two projects, but that's again another expenditure.
Yeah, that's about right. You covered it.
Yeah.
It was all very reasonable, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
everything was the line items, they went
I
through
agree.
line by line, and it was all quite reasonable. And and a lot of these things, last thing you want to do is defer, because you defer, the price just goes up.
Right, it'll get worse.
And yes, that's the other thing, Mike. You're right. That's why I think that Cherry Lawn got finally put back in, because you have a risk that the price is going up, and without question, the aeration that we put in there for $18,000 hasn't solved anything.
Right.
And so the condition of the pond is getting worse. And so that ultimately ends up being a health hazard to, kids go down there. So, and used to be able to get tadpoles and other things out of there. And quite honestly, this year, the Darien Nature Center, to go and get those for their classrooms and other things like that they're doing, actually had to go to New Canaan to get them, because they weren't in the pond anymore. So I think, though, that's maybe $100,000 to do.
Yeah, I want to say something about the two beaches. Weed Beach has a great park for grandkids. I don't know what the Pear Tree Beach has in the way of park or stuff for the kids, or if they're going to put that on Great Island someday, or if it's they don't have anything at all, or it's part of the plans. I guess that's my question.
So I'm going to give you my definition of the two beaches. My family was a Weed Beach family for myself and my 4 kids. It's also closer to where I live than to drive all the way down to Pear Tree. We went to Pear Tree if the kids wanted to play with the fiddler crabs, because you know where the main beach is and you have the house, there's a little alcove in there, and all the fiddler crabs were there. So the deal was you could play with the fiddler crabs. You just had to return them back to the water because no fiddler crabs are coming home. So the other thing is that, you know, you look at personalities of parks and they can really be there. Pear Tree is a quieter, more reserved beach. It doesn't have the swing sets, has a little picnic area. It used to have a concession stand, but it's really a quieter beach than Weed Beach. I sort of jokingly, because I like making fun because people can relate to this, I kind of say that we've built Weed Beach to be Disney World. It has the tennis courts, the racket courts, it has parkland all over the place, it has a nice beach, it has a good concession stand, has a great playground based upon the ages going on. There's a nice walking area. Actually, if you walk around, there's some exercise things there. That's where we hold a lot of concerts, exhibits, other things like that. Bands play there and other things along that line. I describe Pear Tree Point as Rye Playland, which is a much quieter type of amusement park, but both of them need to be maintained. And we haven't done a good job of maintaining Pear Tree. There was an exercise once before to see what we could build there. If we touch the building, because it's in a flood zone, it would have required a significant amount of investment because of the flood requirements and putting it on stilts and elevators and all this other stuff. So we're allowed to touch and maintain about 20% of that without having to get into FEMA. But the rest of this is that we're actually losing beach at Pear Tree Point. Every time it rains, the water just floods in, and it happens rather quickly. So people could be at the beach just thinking it's a nice day, and the tide and everything comes in there, and all of a sudden they're driving in, 12 inches of water to get out of there. On the far end, you have the boat club that's there, and there's a launch. And somebody asked me recently, when was the last time we did anything on the launch? And I've been around for 20 years. I'm sure Bill is that, and I could ask Bill Smith. I don't think either one of us can recall when they did the last time they did the launch. And it's at the wrong angle, and the basin that it goes into needs to be dressed, although that will be taken off. I will say for Pear Tree Point and what needs to be done, they do have some estimates. The 10 million is the max. So they're not intending to go over. They built in contingency to have potentially some other things go, but it's setting up a berm. The other thing that sort of bothers me is once the sand gets, into the parking lot, sometimes they pick up that sand and put it back on the beach, which it just doesn't sound like it's healthy. So this should stop the erosion of the beach. This should also elevate and eliminate some of the flooding with some catch basins in that, and it will improve. Now, Monica asked to see if there were some other private public partnerships that could be established to work on the ramp and some of the other work that we're doing on Pear Tree. So, but that's up to the Board of Selectmen to. We do have potentially a $300,000 contribution to work being done on Weed Beach. That was a gift that was given a number of years ago before that got stopped before. The original walkway was going throughout the entire property with boardwalk in the wetlands and other things like that. And that got killed because it was even more than what they propose now. But it appears as if the Darien Foundation might be contributing up to $300,000 for that project, which will lower the cost. That needs to be revalidated because it's been some time. But, that's one of many things that the Darien Foundation has generously contributed to this town. So, and we thank them for everything they have done. But not only here, the schools and other charitable groups within town. So, I did want to show one other thing. That, again, I'm trying to figure out how to get out of here. There's another screen that I would like to share. To explain something.
You probably have to stop sharing and then share the next
Yeah, that's what they changed this one on where it's supposed to be for me, so it's driving me nuts. New share. Okay, fine. Here we go. Okay, I'm gonna move this again. This is a reconciliation to show how we do certain things in town. And this is one of the slides I presented in 2023 for fiscal year 24. So we now do a separate tax calculation for the mill rate for capital, and then we put it directly into the capital fund as opposed to moving it into the general fund and then moving it into the reserve for capital. But in this year, we started out, our adjusted grand list was 8.8 billion. There was a capital of requests of the combined two schools, schools in town of approximately $4.7 million. The prior year was 6 million. So in the prior years, we bonded 1.3 million. We weren't bonding in 24, but that's one of the tools we'll use. We'll just bond things, and that takes it out from actually being part of what we need to raise through taxes. There's revenues associated with the reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenditures. So that also reduces the capital because we're counting that revenue. Then within the reserve fund for capital is a contingency account where when a project is done, we close that project out to the contingency. We do it twice a year in September and in March. So if something's over just a little bit, they'll take funds from that capital reserve account. If it costs less than what it is, it replenishes money into that reserve account, that contingency. That contingency is controlled by the Board of Finance. And in fiscal year 23, we allocated $100,000 of that fund to pay for capital items and thereby reduce that was needed for taxes. The other big thing that's coming, and we'll do it every year, and part of the reason why we need to know how much investment income we think we're going to have at the end of the year, what the surplus balances of the Board of Selectmen or the Board of Ed are going to be, because that's in there. Plus a couple of other, what grants we've gotten, what other ones we're not getting. And they all go into the fund balance. And then based upon what the desired amount is that we should have in there, which is probably 15 to 16% is the real number of the total budgets, operating budgets, and including debt and capital should be in our general fund, plus certain requirements by the rating agencies. We will take money out of fund balance and use it to pay for capital. The only thing we will use those general fund balances for is for unexpected expenditures or capital. We do not use that to pay down operations. So this is something that started with about 4.7 million. This is just the capital side. And by using these other things, we ended up being about 1.8 million. In the prior year, which we had about 6.1 million between bonding, revenue, fund balance, capital reserve, we reduced that 6.1 to 1.3 million. And that's the amount that we use to raise for taxes. That's what the taxpayers paid for directly. Now, there's, let's see. There's another slide that I want to get to. I gotta keep moving these. Okay. So this is on the operating budgets. And what I try and do is a reconciliation from what the mill rate is and reconcile it to the final mill rate. So in this particular case, and this is the funny thing we were talking about, we moved the new the Norotan Heights Fire Department retaining wall to off-cycle. By the way, I want you to see that that was $110,000, not the 2 million that we're currently talking about. But that got moved off cycle. We took about we took some transfers from unassigned fund balances in for 1.6, and this is our total operating. And that, so we took 2.6 there. We had, which we talked about on the prior page. We had revenues from the reserve fund. We had other non-tax revenues. This year we got ARPA. So we got about 6 billion in ARPA funds. We also had some other revenues coming that was not anticipated. But here's the interesting part. So remember when I was talking about that the grand list grew $0.6 billion? No, not billion. $8.6 million this year. For fiscal year 24, when we were experiencing a 1.5% growth in our grand list, if you multiply the grand list by our current year's tax rate, that generated an incremental $1.6 million that we get to use to offset the next year's budget. So it's actually the current year's, but because the grand list grew by like 1.5% for the current fiscal year, that generated $1.6 million. And that offset some of the growth that we were having in the town budget. I mean, here's the town budget, 24, you see it's growing by 8.4%. Here's the Board of Ed budget at 3.5. This year, with the growth of $8 million, and the adjusted total even being a little bit less, that'll generate someplace in the neighborhood of only $700,000. In the last couple of years, we've had 2 million, 1.6, $1 million of incremental revenue coming in simply because our grand list grew. And had the grand list been used, on the old rate, we would have ended up with more. So with all these different tools that we have, moving things, bonding things, revenues that are coming in on the reserve funds, other non-tax revenues that we're getting in here, and the growth in the grand list, those are all tools that will be used to lower the end and final mill rate. And so that's part of what we'll be going through in the Board of Finance. And they're going to be looking at how much are they going to go from unassigned fund balance, the general fund, to go in. So that's part of the reason why what the grand list did is important to us. Plus, we will now be spreading that amongst, if we maintained it the same amount, we had no growth, we're spreading it amongst a wider range, obviously. But I did want to show you that we actually reconcile this on an annual basis on what goes on. So, let me see, get this back. That's basically, I don't know if there's questions on that. We'll be speaking a lot of that in the future, when we're going through the budget and that. Are there any questions on that? I know that's kind of hard sometimes to understand all those component parts, but those are the things that when Jim Palin built his model, he made assumptions for every one of those to determine where he thought the mill rate would come out, which also then backs up into what the operating budget's range could be if we're within this range of the mill rate. Now, if we say that based upon the real operating budgets of this town, that needs to be bigger, then the increase in the mill rate will be bigger. But that's how what I've been saying, masking the real cost to run this town. So, and that sometimes a 3 or 3.5% mill rate increase. Yeah, this weren't gimmicks. These are true financials, and we maintain a healthy general fund to maintain our AAA rating, but it wasn't really reflecting what it was costing to run. And our citizens only see a 3% increase in the mill rate. So we must be able to afford all these other things. When all those other things are variables and change every year, so those same tools aren't necessarily available to us. So I'm not giving anybody excuse. I'm just trying to explain some of the things that we're going to be covering with the Board of Finance over the next couple of weeks. All right. If there's not any other questions, we do have a set of minutes to vote on. So can I have a motion from somebody? I see Louisa to approve the minutes of the 22nd. Do I see a second? Bill, I'm looking at you, and Bill Smith. I'm taking Bill Smith as a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I apologize that this has run longer than I anticipated. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I have Peter. I can't see everyone, so I don't know who else is there. But Holly, if you get a second, that's fine. All in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening. And if you have any other questions, feel free to call. All right?
Sure.
Good night.
Night, everyone.
Good night.